Hello and welcome to our live webinar, Rebuilding Trust in Government Telecom. This is going to be a live expert panel. My name is Mark Lindsay. I'm an engineer here at ECG. We do work in voice service providers. We'll tell you a little bit about that later. I'm here with Chelsea Sizemore. She's an associate member of technical staff here at ECG and does a lot of work in public sector telecom networks. And I'm also here with Brett Nemiroff. He's the vice president of engineering at Numerical. Numerical is heavily involved in innovating our trust in, among other things, the telecom networks. And he has over 25 years of network engineering experience, particularly in the voice service provider space. So we're like service provider engineering family here on this webinar. So we look forward to getting your questions. We really appreciate you guys joining. A little bit about ECG. So we do voice network engineering as our biggest focus area. So we come alongside the network engineering teams and the operations teams and product teams at service providers and public sector organizations and help them build and innovate their networks and services. So we work also with internet service providers. A lot of our clients are both voice and internet service providers. Our public sector organizations are some of our favorite clients to work with. Like I mentioned, Chelsea does a lot of work there, but we work with some of these other clients as shown here on the slide. We do training and operations so we can help teams kind of understand technology better, bring it into more operational readiness, and also to help just with day-to-day operations. So detecting alerts, helping troubleshoot individual issues, in addition to those network build-out projects where you need to do something new, you need to merge a network, add a new product, or replace a technology and that kind of thing. So that's a lot about what ECG does. I'm going to first go here in a minute to Brett, who's going to talk about a lot of the technology history of how we look at who's calling. So that basic caller ID technology, as we call it here in the United States, and then where that is kind of has led us down and then where that's going, some new options there. And then Chelsea is going to talk to us about a specific case study of a state government network and what it would look like as we roll out that future technology and where kind of the gaps are today for being able to do trustworthy telecom, trustworthy communications on those telephone calls, both inbound and outbound, and how a complex government state network really works. And so she's going to be sharing that with you. We'll also have time for your questions, so you can use the Q&A panel here in Zoom to send questions to me, and we're going to take some time right at the end of the hour to take those questions. So first, Brett, I'd like you to ask you to share a little bit. I know you've put together a little bit of a background presentation for us here that we're going to talk through together, but I wonder if you could start us off talking about kind of where the history of all this started.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of a review of like caller ID, and I'm just going to hit this just a little bit just to kind of explain how we got into this situation to begin with. And caller ID really started its development in the early to mid 80s. We didn't really get to see it until the 90s or so. And it looked like this little device that would sit on our countertop. And some of you may be familiar with this, maybe had one of these. I know that I had one of these. Now, things were different back then because this was really before divestiture, when there was really the phone company. And when people went to the phone company, they knew who you were when they put your name on this little box here. After divestiture, and we ended up having the proliferation of service providers, there ended up being, at this point now, there's over 3,000 separate service providers that all do things a little bit differently now, especially the way that they collect names. The way that it works today isn't a whole lot different than the way that it worked back then when it comes to caller ID name display. And generally, there's absolutely no verification these days on how content is used. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not supposed to be verifying content, but I can tell you from experience, very frequently, this content is not validated. And just to review a little bit about how caller ID works, your agency will work with your service provider, your originating service provider, and they will take the name of your agency along with your phone number, and they send it into something called LIDB, or the Line Information Database. The LIDB, and there's actually multiple LIDBs, these operate as sort of centralized databases for caller name display. They take your name and your number, and they send it into the LIDB. When you make a phone call, you send your phone number from your originating service provider to the terminating service provider. That's the service provider of the person that you're trying to call. Every call works this way. That terminating service provider will take that phone number, dip it inside of the LIDB database, basically say, here's the phone number I got, what was that name? And that name comes back, and then they go on to transmit that name information to the call destination. Now, this methodology, which once again was developed more than 30 years ago, is really susceptible to a couple of different kinds of impersonation attacks that we've seen. Now, here's two separate kinds of impersonation. Now you see these two screenshots. These are actual screenshots from real phones. If I were to ask you which one of these two calls was actually coming from the White House, you would probably say the one on the left. The reality is neither one of these is a call from the White House. What you see on the left-hand side is a call with a faked name. In other words, this call is really from 703-712-2101. So that's a real phone number, but the name associated with that phone number is fake. On the right-hand side, we have a different kind of impersonation. This is transmission of a spoofed phone number. That 202-456-1414, that really is the switchboard phone number of the White House. But the call that made this phone ring did not actually come from the switchboard at the White House. Now, interestingly enough, you can see that the name transmitted when the number was faked is GSA Bill Once. That's actually the caller ID that you would get if the switchboard at the White House were to call you, which leads to a couple other failures that we commonly see. So first of all, the one on the right, you can see sometimes CNAM just doesn't get updated. It's not frequently checked against valid sources. It's not verified very frequently. So it is not uncommon to see values that are transmitted that don't make sense or are antiquated. The one that you see on the left-hand side, this is probably really common, and I bet a bunch of your agencies out there have seen this happen a lot. This is a real phone call that really came from the Social Security Administration. If you log into the Social Security Administration's website and it asks to do a two-factor authentication, one of the options is you can have them call you on your phone to verify your identity. This is how the call shows up. Interestingly enough, you can see it says scam likely on it, and that is really the phone number of the Social Security Administration. You can also see there's no check mark on this particular phone call. So StirShaken has also failed on this particular call. This is a real call from the Social Security Administration. This is not a spoofed call. So you can see here a couple of different ways that call analytics and CNAM, caller ID name, have failed us. Now, just to review, if you're a bad actor and you're wanting to impersonate one of these agencies, super easy. All you have to do is take their phone number and transmit that phone number across. That's usually enough to get your agency's name to show up on the in-person's device. And if you don't believe me, take a look at this. This is a couple of screenshots that I've taken from a couple of popular phone companies, specifically the screens that are used to change your name. And you can see most of these just have a first name, last name field. You can put whatever you want in there and just hit submit. And then bam, that's your caller name information. So you may be asking, well, doesn't StirShaken prevent these kinds of problems? I'm going to review really quickly, and I'm not going to get too technical here. What does StirShaken actually do? First of all, look at the box on the right. That's what's actually inside of a shaken passport. That's the whole thing. Okay, the important bits on this particular passport here is the X5U parameter, which is a certificate of the service provider who made the call. So this has nothing to do with your agency or an enterprise or the person who's making the call. This is the service provider's identity. And then you can see also in there is the destination phone number and the origination phone number. Okay, that could have been set to anything that the service provider wanted. So part of the problem that we have with StirShaken is it requires this kind of implicit trust that the service provider is doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. Now, one thing that StirShaken does do is it does have that certificate, that X5U parameter, which really does point the finger directly at that service provider. So if something's going wrong, we at least know who made the call. But it doesn't really do anything for protecting the phone number. Like I said before, there's over 3,000 service providers in the United States. We know, because there's enforcement actions out there, that plenty of those service providers do things that they're not supposed to be doing. So you may be saying that, only A-level attestation shows caller ID name or legacy branding. These are branding solutions that are commercially available today that are based on the phone number. And you may say that it's protected because we only do branded calls when there's A-level attestation. But fact of the matter is that there are service providers out there that will say, your business is important to me. I will sign everything with an A. That happens. It's not supposed to happen, but it happens, and it happens a lot. As long as we can't trust the service providers, we can't trust the phone numbers as a method for identity. In fact, if you took a look at that call that I showed a couple of slides ago, you'll see the White House call had the stir, shake, and check mark on it, and the name was wrong. You can see this method already has failed us. I don't know why we focus so much on phone numbers as an industry where we are so attached to them. We've been using phone numbers for, well over, 50, 60, 70 years now to place calls. But I like to take these digital problems and compare them to analog issues that we run across every day. People showing up at your house. How do you greet a stranger that shows up at your door? You wouldn't open the door and say, hey, what's your phone number? Or what's your address? Or how do I get back to your office? Like, we don't care what their address is. We want to know, who are you? We want an identity of who you are. So just to review what a phone number is, it's a routing indicator. It's a way of getting back to someone. How do we call them? It's an ephemeral resource. We take these numbers, we put them on your agency, we take them off, we give them to someone else, we'll move departments, we'll disconnect them, we'll ask for new ones. They move around. They're not permanent. It's not like your identity, which is permanent. It was a requirement for phones with buttons. We had to push those numbers. That was the only way that we could call people. And fundamentally, it's a requirement of antiquated signaling. On the phone number we have today, it uses phone numbers. We kind of have to use them, but we don't have to use them as an indication of identity. So in talking about what can we do different, I've kind of broken down the needs of doing something different into what I call the pillars of trusted communication. There's 3 basic things that you have to have. And when your agency is evaluating strategies and new technologies for what you can do to improve this situation, you need to make sure that all 3 of these exist, or there will be problems or potential for impersonation. The first part is a verifiable, trustable entity, identity. Specifically, what this means is that someone needs to verify that your agency really is who you are, that you didn't show up and just say that I am this agency. Someone needs to be able to verify and vet the information that you've given them, that you are the identity that you're claiming to be. And then when we create this identity, we need to protect it as a cryptographic proof. This needs to be something that only you can use. Generally, in cryptography, we do this with public keys and private keys and certificates. So it needs to be something that looks like that. It needs to be something that someone can't steal from you. The second thing you need is a secure, authenticated transmission. In other words, we need to make sure that this identity can make it from you and your agency to the person that you're calling in a meaningful way that can't be stolen, can't be replayed, can't be repeated, and can't be faked. And the third part that we need is a trustable presentation. And this part, I almost think, is one of the most important parts. As consumers, we look at our phones today, we already have gotten to a point where we know what we do trust and what we don't trust. We look at our phone and we see a particular brand name on there. We don't know necessarily if we can trust it. In fact, what we know is that I can't trust it. So we need to do something different. We need to do something that's new and novel so that people can look at their phones and say, this looks different. I recognize this logo, and this makes sense because I'm expecting to get this particular call. So make sure you have all 3 of these components whenever you're evaluating any kind of technology. So just to review a little bit about how Stir Shaken works today, and this is already happening likely with your agency and the communication that you're doing. You make a phone call to your service provider. Your service provider takes that call and they authenticate that call. They basically say, I know this particular customer, I'm going to sign it. And that creates that passport that I showed you before. And then they send that passport along with the call. But the terminating service provider, they don't know you, they don't know the originating service provider. All they have is this passport. And they can take a look at this and say, that certificate looks like something that's valid in the industry. I'm just going to pass this on. And that's how Stir Shaken works today. What I'm proposing is something that's a little bit more advanced. Now, this is CTIA's BCID, or Branding Calling ID architecture. This architecture is available today. This is brand new. And when I mean brand new, I mean it's like 2 weeks into GA. So this is something that we're capable of doing today. This architecture contains an end-to-end framework. It takes some of the stuff that happened in Stir Shaken that was good and adds on some capabilities to bring identity of your agency into Stir Shaken. Specifically, the way that it works is that your agency would work with an onboarding and a vetting agent. That would be a company like Numerical. There's other companies out there, but we do this process, and we do the KYC, that's know your customer. So in other words, we do all the vetting to make sure that when you tell me your agency name, we verify that you really are who you say you are. Now, CTIA, being an industry leader, has come up with all of the methods and procedures and the standards to give us rigorous requirements for how we perform this vetting. That information is stored in a clearinghouse for service providers. A participating service provider. So this doesn't work out of the box with everybody. So everybody has to join in this ecosystem. A participating originating service provider would then, when you make phone calls, identify you as the caller and pull your rich call detail, that's RCD, out of that clearinghouse. Now, that would be all of the vetted information that's important for presentation, for display to your customers that you're calling. That generally includes the name of your agency, the reason why you're calling, and a verified logo for your agency as well. So the originating service provider would pull that information down, sign it very specifically within this ecosystem. So it's cryptographically signed with a CTIA certificate, and now it's sent as a shaken passport with RCD across the network. And the terminating service provider receives that shaken passport with RCD. They can see that a CTIA issued certificate signed the data. That means that when a name is presented, or reason for calling, or a logo is presented, they know that that information has been vetted and verified within this ecosystem of trust along the same methods and procedures that CTIA has set out.
I wanted to just jump in here. There's a couple of things I like about this. I'll just mention. One is sort of like, especially one is a technical, one is kind of non-technical. The technical one is that, like you already mentioned, Brett, this is built on top of technology that people did a lot of work to build out. So it took a lot of work to convert systems to be able to reliably deliver the identity header, the passport, in Stir Shaken SIP call. So a lot of service providers invested a lot of money and time. And honestly, there's some frustration around that because they haven't seen the payback. It seemed like it's been kind of a fool's errand, and they were required to do it by, government mandate, by the Trace Act a few years ago. And, so they haven't really gotten a lot of value out of that. But what it did was it built the framework by which we can actually deliver RCD when it's actually properly built. So that's the technical side. Basically, you get to use something. There's a little bit of you get something without having to pay a lot for it because you've already paid for it in the past. That's one of the big advantages here. So service providers are already equipped to deliver this data. We're not asking for anything new. Whereas the initial Stir Shaken rollout was a little bit of a lift for SBCs, for the calling servers, for the integrations with HTTPS and other types of technology. So that's the technical side. The non-technical side, I don't think engineering folks should miss, which is, can you go back to your previous slide, where basically you've got the onboarding and vetting process. That's a fundamentally non-technical element that has to be done really carefully, because not only are they checking, for example, to be sure that you're using our legit, Social Security Administration logo, for example, they're also verifying that nobody else is, so that if you're not the Social Security Administration, you're not using the SSA's logo. That's a big deal, because it's both the positive case and the failure case. They're defending against misuse of logos. The other thing is that organizations, a typical federal agency might have 40,000 phone numbers. That's actually kind of bigger than the scale that most of the service providers are kind of in the process of doing KYC on. The KYC is kind of weak. And often what I see is that's going to be handled contractually. They're going to try to sign a contract with an agency or a university and say, hey, do you promise to never send me a phone number that you don't own? And so this gets signed, and then now it's contractually, they've tried to delegate that responsibility to the agency or service provider. Well, as soon as you have call forwarding use cases that nobody thought of, now you're sending phone calls that you don't really own, and they end up turning on options to allow that call to go through. And so we, just like Brett, like you said a minute ago, like you lose a lot of the value of this A-level attestation because, well, we thought we had tested it, but it was actually a bigger problem. So I think the vetting, which is fundamentally non-technical, kind of is help that you need. It's something that has to be done in an effective, efficient way, in a reliable way, even at very large scale. We usually think of, Social Security Administration has 2 or 3 phone numbers on their website. but they probably have 50,000 phone numbers that have to be vetted, and other agencies and state governments and universities are going to be in the same situation. So anyway, I just wanted to underline those. I think that's really good elements of kind of what's been thought through here, because it's building on existing technology, and then it's really taking the challenge of vetting, taking it as a serious challenge.
Absolutely. And another point that I wanted to underscore that you had mentioned is the payback from Shaken. There's a lot of people who think that, and I want to be careful how I say this, that Shaken was a failure. And I think it's more than anything, it's a marketing failure. I think that the marketing side of it promised that it would do something that it was never really designed to do. Stir Shaken was not designed to protect phone numbers. It just wasn't. And that's what most people think that Stir Shaken is for. And when you take a look at legacy branding solutions that are dependent on A-level attestations, they are dependent on Stir Shaken protecting the phone numbers. The reality is if you take a look at the standards, and it's written like this in the standards, it is local policy to assign attestation. Now, they do say in the standards, these are in the actual ATTest standards, that an A-level attestation requires KYC. Well, what is KYC? What does that mean? KYC literally stands for Know Your Customer. I know you, Mark. Have I vetted you? So KYC means different things to different people. It needs to be properly defined. What exactly have you done to know your customer? In CTIA's ecosystem, and I like to call it a coordinated ecosystem of ethics and trust, right? So this means that everybody is basically doing things the same way. The KYC process is rigorous, and it is specifically spelled out exactly what steps you have to do. So just like Mark said, making sure that other people who aren't the Social Security Administration can't use your logo, that is also a part of it as well. Really good points. So getting a little technical, and I'm not gonna sit here too deep on this, but this is the difference between traditional Shaken and Shaken with BCID. And if you take a look at the additional elements in here, CRN, that's a reason for calling. I don't know why they use those letters, but that means reason for calling. And then towards the bottom, you'll see the RCD elements, which include a logo and the name of the business. These are the additional entities that are added inside of Stir Shaken to transmit the identity as well. Now, you may be wondering, this looks easy to edit. This looks easy to change. It looks easy to spoof. This information is only trusted if this passport is signed with a certificate issued by the CTIA. That is the way the CTIA ensures that the data contained in here was put together using the coordinated methods and procedures that they've specified in their contracts. In the end, this is the result that you get. These are examples of branded presentations, and these are real. This is something that we're capable of doing today. These presentations here don't require any additional software on the phone. There's legacy branded solutions out there that can do this kind of thing, but they require customers to install software on the phone. This works on the phone right out of the box, does not require any additional software. The hope here is that when you employ one of these technologies and you call one of your constituents, that they see on their phone something that is unmistakably from your agency and absolutely cannot be faked. In fact, you should always ask, how can this technology be faked? And I'll answer that question for here. It would be a requirement that whoever's faking it has somehow obtained your certificate and your private key. That is something that is, in a properly managed network, is relatively impossible to do. That would require a full-on security breach. In the CNAM world, having them use your phone number and displaying your name, that's something that anybody can do. That's an easy thing for someone to change their phone number. So where we would really like to go with this, and this is kind of where I'm going to leave it for you guys, is we really want agencies to be able to identify themselves. We really want them to be able to sign their own calls. We recognize that you guys are technically capable enough to do this, to participate in this process. There's some reasonably technical reasons why this isn't done today, because you may be asking, like, this stuff looks great. We're ready to go. We're technically inclined. We can sign calls ourselves. Give us these tools. We can do that. And the passports look easy. We'll add those fields in. The reality is what it comes down to is whether or not the terminating service provider, the phone company on the other side, whether or not they'll trust any of this stuff. And right now, they do not trust enterprises and agencies to be able to manage their own certificates. Now, Numerical as a technology evangelist, this is something that we constantly push. We want the industry to recognize that enterprises, government agencies are capable of managing this themselves, that we need to get the technology further advanced so that you guys can do this yourself. That's definitely where we want it to go. But for a first step, using something like BCID, branded calling ID, is a huge step forward from the legacy branding in a way of protecting your brand in your agency's name.
That's great. Yeah, appreciate you introducing that and telling us about the motivations for doing that. So Chelsea, I'm going to ask you to share here. I know you've spent some years really working in a couple of different public sector networks, and one that you're going to really highlight today. Can you go through kind of how this network is put together, and then emphasize for us what makes it different from service provider networks?
Yeah, so we'll first talk about the kind of state government network overview. So I do a lot with particularly the state of Maryland, their Department of IT, and help with their network. So a little bit of an overview. They have kind of a unique structure with their network. They're not like a typical service provider or a typical enterprise. They have these kind of decentralized networks with independent agencies and departments that kind of connect into the state government's voice network. And each kind of department within the state has their own challenges with maintaining security, reliability, and interoperability based on each department's kind of requirements and standards. So here is a very basic overview of kind of an example of a state government network. So we have these different clouds, which represent different kind of networks. And on the left, we kind of have, like on the core side, the private side are these different departments in their networks. And within these networks, they have the PBXs or SBCs, any kind of those kind of equipment that manage voice and have their phones connecting to those devices that are kind of restricted within their network that connects into the state government network, which is kind of like the link to the PSTN service provider. And so, but each department within the state kind of manages their own equipment and network. So this creates kind of this hybrid enterprise from the state government's standpoint, because the state networks are considered enterprises because they're not a service provider according to the FCC's definitions for a service provider. And then multiple departments use different PBXs or SBCs, like I mentioned. And this kind of creates this different enterprises, like each department being kind of their own enterprise with managing their users and phone numbers and devices within their own department. And then the network management. So these departments purchase connections to the state government. Then the state government manages the routing to the PSTN service provider. So the state government kind of manages the underlying network to the PSTN for those state department networks to connect to. And then each one of these departments kind of have their own purposes for making calls or receiving calls and have different needs for their user data. And so a couple examples, the Department of Labor has a high capacity, they require a high capacity for inbound calls. So they have a lot more of their calls are inbound calls from the PSTN, the citizens within the state that are calling into the Department of Labor's call center to check on their unemployment benefits or if they need to provide information. And then the Department of Revenue may focus on have more focus on outbound calls out to citizens where they're doing kind of tax related purposes.
Yeah, I think one of
So
the interesting things that we found about like the state network, the state government network, is that it really has a lot in common with service providers, even though, like you said, like it's not technically a service provider. They don't file a FCC 499, all the things that you would need to do to be a service provider. So it puts them kind of outside some of the boundaries of obviously of regulation, but also of capabilities. They don't have the flexibility there. But if a service provider who's watching this webinar went and looked at, wanted to win one of these type of customers, and they asked standard enterprise questions like, well, what's the SBC technology that you're using, or what's the PBX technology that you're using? There could be half a dozen answers to that question that are all legit because all of that traffic is involved. So they're doing real, like in this network, like you point out, they're doing real call routing internally to their network between different organizations. And frankly, if you look at other large enterprises, for example, in the financial services industry, you find some of the same kind of thing. What I tend to see though is more because these are often like larger organizations are often multinational, then they're using service providers that are localized, whereas a government is intrinsically kind of has a geography that they're covering, and so they tend to have more localization, fewer service providers than like a multinational bank is going to have from what we've seen, from the examples that we've seen. So there's a lot of service provider like technology and use cases and complexity. The different calling patterns you mentioned, they vary a lot. The call rate, the call answer rate, the directionality of the calls, those things all vary a lot, just like they do at a medium-sized service provider with tens of thousands of active users. But they're not considered a service provider. They're considered an enterprise, and so they're really a special case. So I like your summary here. I think is really helpful.
yeah, thank you, Mark. So next we'll kind of move into use cases and potential benefits that a state government network could benefit from having the kind of current call authentication and caller ID. So of course, the value with call authentication is establishing trust. So with the current caller ID, the goal is to establish trust and have the official name and logo of the individual departments show up on the end user's phone. So the citizen that the department is calling, they would want to establish trust because the state's goal is that they can reach every citizen within the state, and that the citizen will trust that it's the government and answer the calls, because that's their main goal, is that all their calls get answered, basically. And this would help establish and increase the likelihood that citizens would answer the calls from the government. Another example is the importance of branded caller ID for emergency services. So this goes into establishing and still have the public's trust that it's coming from an emergency service. So an example here in South Georgia, a couple weeks ago, we had a hurricane come through, and we have a system that sends out emergency alerts to the citizens that subscribe to that service. And they send out phone calls and that read off a message to the citizens about the hurricane warning, potential wind impacts, telling them not to cut power lines that are down in the road, kind of very important public safety things. And whenever I receive the call, it shows up as an 800 number. It doesn't really say anything. I couldn't actually trust that the caller name, the caller ID that showed up, was from the government. And so luckily, I answered the call because I identified the phone number because of research and looking into the number that the alert system uses. But a lot of the public don't trust just answering any phone number that calls them. And so kind of this importance is, it could be for like weather events or health events, public safety, anything like that we would want to make sure that the citizens of the state actually trust that it's the government letting them know, because currently that could be spoofed because that information is public of what the phone number is that the emergency services used. And it could technically be, somebody send out misinformation about a weather event or public safety. And so it's currently not really trusted to be actually from the government. And another benefit would be to enhance the resident experience with it. So branded caller ID reassures that the recipients about the caller's identity. So this increases the efficiency in communication. So if the end user can verify that it's the actual government calling, they'll increase it. It increases the efficiency that the calls will be answered. So an example of this, if the state governments were able to get the more recent technologies for branded caller ID, and the departments within the state do send the rich call data with the call reason. So the state health department could send out calls about scheduled appointment reminders, and it'll display the relevant information to ensure that the resident would answer the call knowing, oh, that's the state health department calling to verify my appointment, and not just kind of brush it off. And I think, it's similar with other just doctor's appointment, not just the state health department. They send out calls that are kind of automated to confirm appointments. And so just from the state standpoint, being able to do that and it's showing that it's from the state health department, that would be beneficial. So next is message recognition. So branded calls help citizens identify official and trustworthy communications. So an example, the Department of Labor. So it is that most of the calls are inbound to the Department of Labor for people to check their status, but it's also the case that the Department of Labor will need to make outbound calls to citizens to verify information about unemployment benefits. And so the goal is that the citizen would want to trust that it's from the Department of Labor about their benefits, and having that branded caller ID show the reason that it's from the Department of Labor, and that it'll increase the trust and ensure the calls are answered. And another example is the Department of Revenue. So their outbound calls are generally for debt collection, which benefits the state's budget. And so the state would really want those calls to be answered. And so having that display the call reason might improve the response rates from the citizens. So that's another key use case there.
Yeah, I want to mention something related to, in the news, cybersecurity news, there's a lot of discussion of foreign state actors that are active in trying to penetrate core infrastructure services in the United States. They're not always very active. They sometimes just gain a foothold so that they potentially could do some sort of action. So the Wall Street Journal does a lot of reporting on this. And so in those particular cases, you have examples where a bad actor, basically an adversarial state actor, may wish to disrupt the communication of the government or of the citizens, of the residents there, and potentially interfering with communications abilities, confusing communication so they're putting out false flags or sort of misinformation intentionally in order to disrupt state government or federal government operations. That kind of thing is actually a real scenario that's discussed by law enforcement and defense officials in the United States. One of the cool things about the technology that's available now, if it's implemented, like the use cases you're giving here, they would benefit from being able to move to authenticated mechanisms for signaling who they are, why they're calling. And the nice thing about these technologies is that they actually are cryptographically strong at a level that, as far as people know, there's no state actor that's able to overcome them. So that we're not talking about just trying to make it harder than, so it's harder to spoof or harder to fake than your typical kind of like a criminal or organized crime organization would be able to do. We're actually using, when we talked about things like the CTI branded calling technology as an example, or just using stir shaken, like in this particular case, just to have an authenticated calling identity. We're talking about using really some of the best technology that we know of in order to prevent this. And this has not only trust implications, but also national defense implications that may well help to defend the population against misinformation and communication and breakdown of effective governance and communication there. So these are, like you mentioned, a couple of cases within like Department of Labor, Department of Revenue. You mentioned the health services case, which, you know, over 1,000 hospitals in America are actually operated by state and federal government. So they're a large player. The public sector is a large player in just healthcare in the United States. All these cases are important, and the implications of getting this right and doing this effectively and well really goes beyond mere convenience or kind of higher likelihood of answering calls, which those are important. They actually go to just the proper functioning of government.
Mark, I
Yeah.
wanted to piggyback on one of your comments there about getting it right, because I think it's also important to talk about what happens if you get it wrong, right?
Yeah.
What are the risks of doing this wrong, or of implementing a technology that isn't quite as secure? You know, going back to what I was saying before about the pillars of trusted communication, you really need that new and novel approach of displaying your agency's name and logo to a consumer. You want to invoke that trust so that they know absolutely that it's you. If technologies are allowed to use a similar presentation method, and they aren't as secure on the backside, in other words,
Right.
dependent on a phone number that could be spoofed, people will very quickly learn that here's another way for people to scam us, for people to trick us. And not only that, if a legacy branding solution that is ultimately phone number based were allowed to display your agency's logo, it would be a very compelling impersonation case. It's very, very dangerous. In fact, at Numerical, working with some government agencies, we've actually even advised them against using some legacy branding solutions because they're just not secure enough. They're not as good as the newer cryptographic-based branding solutions like BCID that's coming out there. So I just want to put that point out there that there is an inherent risk to doing it wrong as well. And that's something that you really need to be careful of.
For
Yes.
sure.
Yeah. So quickly, just the benefits for internal state government communication. So just would enhance the recognition that calls between the departments within the state government would be trusted and authenticated, and increase the recognition and prioritization of the internal calls within the departments and between departments. So next we'll go into risks and challenges with implementing the call authentication and kind of the legacy unauthenticated caller ID. So this is not this new CTIA branded caller ID. So in the state government, it's cost. That's just how it is. So the difficulty in justifying the investment without assuring the end-to-end security with the legacy caller ID. And the technologies that are out currently, just it's difficult for people within the state that are managing the budgets to justify the cost of those technologies with it having those challenges of not being secure. So this is with the risk that the logos and calling names could be spoofed or copied in the current CNAM database, and current branded calling solutions aren't secure enough to prevent spoofing as they are today. Another kind of limitation is network compatibility issues. So technologies currently may not be fully integrated into all networks. So a lot of states, there's the big three service providers, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon. They could operate these technologies and access the current databases, but smaller service providers are concerned. Like US Cellular, this has been brought up within the state of Maryland. A lot of their citizens use US Cellular for their phone service. And so those smaller service providers might not support access to the current databases for the caller ID information. And so the state's concern is that the current technologies are not mature enough to guarantee widespread availability of branded caller ID to all the users within the state, depending on, for any service provider that they use. Another is the distributed implementation issues. So as I mentioned before, with how the network is set up with the different departments, is that each department manages their own equipment. And it's Stir Shaken was intended for end users, like departments, to sign their own calls. And so the departments aren't classified as service providers, obviously, because they're within the state government, which is an enterprise. And it's kind of up to the originating service provider to sign the calls currently as it's written. And because the departments are not able to get the necessary certificates to actually sign the calls. So they have the technology and devices that are able to do it. They just can't get the right certificates to sign the calls and add the caller ID data with today's technology. And then the current standards are focused on the larger service providers. So there's a lack of consideration for state government scenarios with decentralized departments because they're a little bit different from the bigger enterprises that are trying to push to get involved with like call authentication and branded caller ID. And there's an implementation gap with commercially available solutions don't adequately address the unique challenges faced by the state government networks or other enterprises for that matter.
Yeah, and it goes not only the state government networks, like you mentioned, enterprises, but also the federal government. I was involved in early conversations around 10 years ago about Stir Shaken, and I was talking about how they routed calls because, like I mentioned there, this is public information that we helped operate part of the network for the U.S. Department of Justice. Talking about the scale of that, how that network integrated with the PSCN. And this is all public information, public contracts. And there was a little bit of surprise about, the federal government, that's how they make phone calls. Well, we'll be sure and include mechanisms to allow something like a trusted government agency, because we're literally talking about people who are mentioned in the Constitution. Like, these are the people who are making calls through this network. So those people, we're going to be sure that we set up mechanisms here so we can trust those. Well, ultimately, kind of fast forward 5 years later, that stuff doesn't really make it in. And so there's no mechanisms built into today's standards that really gave any special mechanisms for elected officials and trustworthy organizations to be able to do this independently. Now, the technology is there, the delegate certificates we might talk about a little bit. So it's not actually like a technology development problem. It's mostly a rollout and procedural kind of a non-technical problem. And I think one of the big steps forward would be having a robust vetting framework where basically organizations like this can say, here are my 40,000 numbers. We are a trusted organization and we can provide the evidence that these are legitimately used telephone numbers to do it. But generally, like you mentioned, the state governments and other enterprises really have been left out of the conversation. And then on the other hand, you have service providers, thousands of service providers who are mostly just agreeing to not break federal law by the way that they do their Stir Shaken implementation, but there's not a lot of enforcement. There's not mechanisms before we get to something like the CTIA's standard. So,
yeah, Mark, those are really good points, and I did want to highlight one of your bits about the distribution of the vetting process. So, like, it's one thing to take a single agency that has 40,000 numbers and having to vet all those numbers. But also consider that these solutions aren't just relevant for government agencies, but they're relevant for, enterprises across the United States as well. And last count, I think there's somewhere in the range of about 30 million enterprises across the United States, all that need their brands protected. So the question is who's responsible for vetting these 30 million enterprises out there? And the existing solutions that are out there simply aren't scalable to do it with the rigor that's required. So one of the reasons why I push CTIA's BCID so much is because it is an open framework. Anybody can become a vetter as long as they adhere to the standards set forth by the CTIA and on board. So this is an ecosystem that has invited participation into the ecosystem so that we can scale it together. And not necessarily competing, but interoperating together to build a safer infrastructure for consumers. That's fundamentally what we need. The technology that we have today, based on CNAM and phone numbers, is 100 years old, and for all practical purposes, it's anonymous communication. Like, you just set whatever phone number you want, call whoever you want with that phone number. That's how it works today, and it's time to make a significant change to improve that technology. And the only way to do it is with a ecosystem, with a framework that defines who's vetting, who's onboarding, how are you signing, what certificates are used. There's got to be cryptography built into this thing. It's got to be end to end. So I feel very strongly that this is the right way for us to go.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah. So that's all I had. And kind of the key takeaway that kind of for my presentation was that state governments could serve the public better if they were able to participate in the call authentication, and possibly, hopefully soon, the new branded caller ID. That would be great.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for that, Chelsea. So we do have a few questions that we're going to bring in, and let me pull those up here. So one of the first questions is probably best answered by Brett. Have you seen any service providers who are already talking about? Now, I know CTIA is generally, we think of it as a wireless service provider organization. Are there any service providers who have made public announcements about adopting the branded caller ID, BCID technology or framework?
Yep. What I can say is there's a handful of service providers that are already working with BCID, and the list grows every day. There aren't any that are publicly announced, but this is something that, like I said, BCID kind of made their first announcement that we're going live only a couple of weeks ago. So we're at the early stages of this. So Numerical, being kind of a shepherd into the ecosystem, we're looking for enterprises. We're looking for government agencies that have partnerships with service providers, and we are working, along with companies like ECG to help these service providers get involved. So what I would say is, yes, there are major service providers doing this. On the cellular side, this is something the big three are looking at. Some of the big three are fully deployed, some are partially deployed, some are no deployed. But this is something that we, I believe, as it picks up traction, people are going to start seeing these, the presentation from these BCID calls. They're going to see how it secures their calls. We're going to see some feedback on what it does for businesses and protecting brands. And it's going to be the kind of thing where entities are going to have to jump onto it. And that's something that Numerical is going to be happy working with service providers to get to that point.
Yeah, the mobile focus makes a lot of sense because in that context, you have a display device. On a smartphone, you're going to have the ability to display something, whereas a legacy terminal is not going to have, an old phone with caller ID display, or even a modern SIP phone from Cisco, Yealink, others. It's not going to have the same display capabilities out of the gate. Now, those systems should be able to implement these things, so you should be able to buy a phone from Poly that can display. And I think technically that's there, integrating that into the service provider. That's the kind of thing we do. So we would be one of those companies that would be help. Let's get the data through. These are our handful, our 12 different devices. And this is how we're going to make it show up properly. And we're going to give the indicator that this is trustworthy data, and this is how you can learn more, and that kind of thing that would be appropriate for that service provider. So I think it makes a lot of sense that it's starting in wireless. Yeah.
But Mark, I do want to add on to that, although it is starting in wireless, because you've got this big, beautiful screen that we have all this real estate to do cool stuff on. It doesn't have to be wireless. And this is something that Numerical pushes every time we talk to a service provider. And, usually the talk starts off on the commercial side of it. It's like, how do we turn this into a product? How do we sell it to our customers? How do we protect our consumers? But it works on both sides of the equation. If you're an originating service provider, you can also be a terminating service provider, and you don't have to be a wireless provider to make this work. You're absolutely right. If you've got a Polycom phone, we can take one of these BCID calls and we can send it a name, we can send it a logo. These are all things that are possible for the future. It's absolutely something that we want to see. But the point that I want to make is that branded calling, even though the ecosystem is called branded calling ID, branded calling is an extra benefit you get on top of authenticated calling. The authenticated calling is the really, really important part of this, is that we're using cryptography to send an identity from the originator to the terminator. And then on top of that, when you know who's making the call, giving it a brand, a presentation is something that's easy to do on top of that.
Yeah, great point. So this is probably a question for both of you, probably Chelsea from your perspective, and Brett, with your knowledge of the BCID architecture. What would you guys see if you think about the state government network as Chelsea described it? What would you see as kind of the obstacles or sort of the hurdles or steps that need to be overcome in order to roll this out, to roll out BCID? I mean, you mentioned a couple of things such as cost, but Chelsea, what comes to mind, in terms of the obstacles to kind of roll out this technology if you were going to put it to work, next year?
Yeah, so probably the obstacles would probably be in the implementation of it and making sure that because of all the different departments, like some have Cisco cubes, some have NEC PBXs, some have different Oracle SBCs, it varies. There's different vendor devices. Right. And so it's the logistics of it, like finding the people within each department that would be responsible for managing those devices and configuring it or doing what needed to be done to find out who within the department would do the vetting process. And so I think it's more of like, that would be probably the main obstacle after, if the state actually went through, found a product that they could justify was secure and then justify the cost of it, then the actual implementation and organization of it would probably be the biggest obstacle.
Just to add on to that, I mean, some of the obstacles that we see for service providers, there is a bit of a lift for service providers in implementing this. Now, if we were to get to the next generation branded calling where enterprises and agencies are able to sign their calls, like what Chelsea's saying is absolutely correct, is like, how do we get all of that technology, all that different technology capable of signing calls? And it's effectively what it's going to end up looking like is similar to like the stir shaken implementations, but it's like now enterprises are going to have to do those kinds of things, which means doing things like certificate management and call signing and all of that. But today, with the BCID that exists today, enterprises and agencies aren't able to sign for themselves. So if we're talking about what's available today with existing BCID, the challenges for a service provider today is right now, first of all, they have to already be doing stir shaken. And we start with an assumption that they're doing that because that's law. They have to be doing that already. In addition to stir shaken, they have to say, okay, this call is coming from this specific agency, which is branding their calls. So they need to recognize that first of all, we're not going to brand all calls day one, right? So this particular agency is branding their calls. When they brand their calls, instead of using a regular stir shaken certificate, we have to use a CTIA certificate. So that's one challenge that they'll have to do. I call it the selective signing process that service providers do, number one. Number two, they have to sign with onboarded and vetted RCD data. So that's something that Numerical does this for service providers already today. We also teach service providers how to do this themselves as well. So they actually have to be able to get that repository of onboarded and vetted data to sign calls with. It's like Mark had said earlier, is that service providers have largely done a lot of this work when they initially implemented stir shaken. There's a couple extra things that have to be done to implement this, but the lift is not huge. It does have to be implemented, though. It does not work out of the box.
Yeah, I'm glad you emphasized the difference there, because we tend to think sort of like over the horizon to the delegate certificates case and sort of the technology implementation. One of the great things about that case will be that you'd be able to have your different departments inside of a state government or your different departments inside of a university. They're going to be able to indicate their call reason on their own technology using their own platform. But as of today, but that's still sort of over the horizon a little bit. What's on the horizon, what we can see and kind of get to, is being able to have an established relationship with a service provider that can implement this, and that service provider uses an appropriate vetting onboarder process in order to participate in BCID themselves. And so you could say, in one sense, the state governments, their job would be to just find that service provider, to work with a service provider who's got that. And so that could be a takeaway if you want to be able to bring this to your your service population, your state, or your constituents on a college campus, then finding service providers, working with service providers who are looking at BCID to be able to roll this out. That's going to be probably your immediate step. And then it's going to be largely that service provider implementation. They're going to be handling that work on behalf of the government entity initially. But we do foresee kind of looking forward to kind of when you can do a little bit better, when you can signal through. Now I can imagine technologies where some of those service providers might provide interfaces, separate SIP trunks for different agencies so that they can properly label those calls, or label's the wrong word there, but basically use the right organization ID so that a call from the Department of Health looks different from a call from the Department of Labor. There's nothing really technically to prevent the service provider from building into that way. It doesn't have to come from, the state of Maryland on every call. It can be done separately, and that can be built out with a little creativity. That could be built out.
Yeah, and Mark, I mean, that methodology with having kind of layered identity already exists in BCID. So even without the individual departments being able to sign themselves, we're able to use BCID today to create custom logos, custom names, and even custom reasons on a call-by-call basis, even with this hybrid network architecture that you have here. So that's possible as well today. It's not quite as flexible as when we get into delegate certificates, but that certainly is possible today.
Great. Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, so I think there's a lot more to talk about. So for somebody looking through implementation, I think you're going to want to work with somebody who's competent and knows the process, and Numerical would be a good first stop there. You're going to want to work with somebody who can help you with the implementation work, because frankly, every engineering organization I know of is pretty busy. And so being able to get this done to provide this value to your population, to your served constituency, is going to be important. And looking at what the options are, including vetting. When you look at, I think, just to circle back to something, you don't want to do this wrong. So if you're looking at branded calling identity solutions out there, you want to vet them yourself. You want to do your own verification to check what is the authentication mechanism, what's the attack vector. And most account managers, if they're selling a product in order to do branded calling to show your logo on your on phone calls, they're not necessarily going to be equipped to do a kind of a red team type analysis to check to see what's wrong with their product or what the limitations are. But you can work with independent organizations like ECG and Numerical to walk through that process to help you ask those questions, to be sure that you're actually implementing something that does it well, rather than going into business with something that's doing it poorly. And as just circle back to something Brett said earlier. Well, we're out of time today. I really appreciate you guys jumping on and joining us in this conversation. I appreciated the questions that came in. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brett. And thank you very much, Chelsea, for your time and your work on this important topic. I know that you're available for questions, and so folks can reach out to you. If you were on the webinar, you're going to get a follow-up email with contact information. Please do reach out with any questions or conversations you'd like to have. I know we'd all three love to chat with you.